Hi, everyone. Welcome to Disgorged Online. I'm Zach Jabal. I am a former, current, who knows, wine educator based here in Seattle, Washington, with Tom Douglas Restaurants. I'm also the host and producer of the Vine Pair podcast, owner of Disgorged, lover of wine. And I thank you so much for joining me here on Saturday. What am I saying? Saturday. It's Wednesday. I literally have no idea what's going on. And it's not just because I've been drinking, I promise. Here on Wednesday, I was thinking to myself that it's fitting and it was intentional that we are finishing up this set of 12 wines and 12 classes with sparkling wine, specifically for me, the 2015 Domaine Carneros Brut. And this is fitting because we started with another bottle of sparkling wine from here in the US, the Gruet Blanc de Noir. And this was, so kind of coming full circle here, going to talk about sparkling wine again. I apologize for those of you who watched every episode. There will be a little repetition here because I wanted to go back over some sparkling wine things, but what can I say? That's just kind of how it is. And I wanted to mention a few things before we dive into this wine. I'll have more at the end of the class here about what's coming next for Disgorged Online, but there will be more content, I promise. We're not getting out of quarantine anytime soon here in Washington, so I got some time on my hands and some wine on my hands, which is good. And then a couple other things to take note of too, as we're kind of wrapping up this segment of it. So if you have time and want to throw me some feedback, I would really appreciate it. You can do it here on the YouTube channel or on Instagram. You can also do it by email at zach@disgorgedwine.com. Really would appreciate your thoughts on how you think things have gone, things we can do in the future, things that we can improve on, etc. Okay, with that being said, let's dive on into this wine. So as I mentioned, pull it back up. This is the 2015 bottle of Domaine Carneros Brut, one of the, I think, finest producers of sparkling wine here in the US. And so let's talk a little bit about sparkling wine in general before we get into this specific wine. So first and foremost, and I feel like I'm a little bit of a broken record on this count with some of the wines I've talked about, but one of the defining characteristics of sparkling wine kind of across the board, of sparkling wine of quality for sure, is acidity. And that's the thing that winemakers are looking for, grape growers are looking for as they're preparing to make sparkling wine. They're looking for to grow wines, or rather grow the grapes to make the wines in a way that really allows that acidity to be the backbone of the wine. And a big part of that reason is that there's something about the interaction between carbon dioxide, which is the sparkling element in sparkling wine, and acidity that works really well. You know, you think about it with even something like that we don't think of as being acidic, but really is something like, soda. If you think of that old, not exactly myth, it's really true that you can like dissolve a nail in Coca-Cola. And that's because there's a lot of acid in soda. And that's why it's also really sweet. And carbon dioxide acts to kind of accentuate that, but it also kind of, for lack of a better word, it sort of gives the acidity some dimensionality. That's kind of a rough and not very, it's kind of not vague exactly, but I know it's not necessarily the easiest concept to wrap your head around, but it really is true. If you were to taste some of these wines, and I've had this opportunity, if you go taste these base wines and even taste, some winemakers do this experiment, and I've had a chance to try it a couple places, where you try one of these wines and it's the still version of it. So it's never been put through any method that carbonates it, but it's been aged the same. It's the same wine. It really does it's amazing how much more complex and lively the sparkling wine feels. And obviously the effervescence is a part of that, but it's also just the reality of the interaction, like I said, between bubbles and acidity. So there are 4 real ways to put bubbles in wine. And the first is forced carbonation. So forced carbonation is injecting carbon dioxide into the wine. And that can be done in a variety of different ways. Years ago, when I started teaching about wine and started teaching about sparkling wine, this would be the point where I was like, forced carbonation wine sucks. And to be fair, there's a lot of really bad forced carbonated wine. Many of the really inexpensive bottles of sparkling wine that you can find in a store are made through forced carbonation, and they're bad. But they're bad not because forced carbonation is bad. They're bad because they're bad wines, and adding carbon dioxide to it isn't going to change that fact. I actually think there's some interesting experiments being done by people with really interesting quality wine that's showing that with forced carbonation wines, you can actually do some interesting things like make a really fresh style of sparkling wine. So you're capturing all the things that we love in a really fresh white or rosé and adding carbon dioxide to that and sealing it. And it gives you this kind of, vibrant, fresh style. Now, there's also, like I said, an ocean of bad forced carbonation sparkling wine, but it's not, again, I come back to this point. I don't think it's because forced carbonation is inherently bad. It's just that a lot of what it's used for is really, really cheap. And it's cheap because the wine, the grapes that go into it are mass, harvested and mass grown and just not that good. The next method, in terms of methodology, I guess, is the tank method. So from everything from here on is going to involve a certain amount of a secondary fermentation, or at least a long fermentation period. So with all three of these methods, you're doing sort of standard still wine making, and then you are doing something else to create the carbonation. But it's something that's involving the wine. You're not just adding carbon dioxide to it. So with the tank method, what you're doing is you're making a still base wine, and then to that you're adding a certain amount of yeast or sugar, or yeast and sugar, or yeast and unfermented juice or whatever, and you're sealing that in a large tank. Tanks vary in size from amount that would fill 100 bottles of wine to something that can fill tens of thousands of bottles of wine. And in that enclosed airtight space, the yeast ferment the sugars and produce alcohol a little bit and carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide is trapped in solution because there's nowhere else for it to go. And then the wine is bottled directly from there. So this is how Prosecco is made. It's how a lot of sparkling wine that's not as fully sparkling is made. And again, there's a lot of great wine that's made this way. I'm like some fair bit of Prosecco, Lambrusco, that's well made. As a kind of another style, that's another Italian style that's made this way that I really like. And there's a lot out there that's that way. The last two methods are going to be, they're going to involve a different sort of thought process. So the final two are the ancestral and the traditional method. The ancestral method is really truly just one very long continuous fermentation. And what it involves is sealing the wine in a bottle, usually with a crown cap, like what you would see on a beer bottle, and doing that with while the wine is still fermenting. So by closing it up in the bottle that way, you are allowing the last bits of fermentation to still kind of produce that carbon dioxide that's trapped in solution, and there you have it. And what's cool about this is that because you have never touched the wine from that point onward, then the yeast and whatnot that are in the bottle, they eventually die because there's nothing left for them to eat, and they remain in contact with the wine as it matures, and that aging process produces some additional flavors, which is also how the traditional method works. There's just an additional step in the traditional method. So with the ancestral method, which is often now labeled as pet nat or pétillant naturel, you get these kind of interesting fruity flavors, but also a lot of these kind of flavors from the yeast that are like cheese or sort of like brioche bread notes, things like that, things that we associate with yeast. And so from that style, you get a little bit of you don't get the sort of intense carbonation that you get out of the traditional method, but you also get a little more of that sort of yeasty note that I was describing. And then the traditional method, also known as the champagne method, is what we'll be focusing on for the rest of this, because this is what Domaine Carneros is. And this involves kind of making, essentially you make a pet nat. So you make a wine, well, not exactly. You make a still wine, you put that in a bottle with some additional yeast and sugar, seal it. Instead of in a big tank, you do it in individual bottles. You allow that to ferment a second time, capture the carbon dioxide, age for a certain amount of time, which can be as little as a few months to a year, to as much as over a decade, depending on the style of wine you're trying to make. And then you eventually remove that dead yeast through a process called disgorging, hence the name. And you, from there, fill the last little bit of the bottle back up with a little bit of additional wine, sometimes often slightly sweetened to balance out the acidity, seal it with a traditional sparkling wine cap, and off it goes into the world. Okay, so my last thing about this is that, as I was sort of trying to get at, all four of these methods have positives and negatives, right? There are good reasons why any given winemaker would choose to make a wine in any of these styles. The first two, the sort of forced carbonation and tank method, are much less expensive, which is why most of the inexpensive wine, sparkling wine out there, is made that way. But they also have some benefits. Like I said, they can preserve elements of the wine that you may lose through this more extended aging process and winemaking process that also involves some contact with lees. The other two methods produce more carbonation typically, or especially the traditional method. And I would say that for making really great sparkling wine, you do generally want a little bit of the additional flavor and complexity that comes with this extended lees aging. But that's not for everyone. Not everyone likes these wines. That's okay. The last thing I'll say about the traditional method and its effect before we move on to the specific wine is that in addition to producing more carbonated wine, a more finely carbonated wine, and in addition to bringing out these sort of like notes of cheese or brioche, the other thing that you can often get in these wines, but not always, is a pretty noticeable kind of nuttiness and oxidative note to the wine. And that's about the way that the wine is made. It can be done to minimize that. And there are some producers of champagne, other sparkling wines that really aim to reduce that. And there are others that, frankly, like that and even attempt to accentuate it. So it's just something to be aware of, that nuttiness is not necessary for making traditional method sparkling wine, but it's often comes along with it. Okay, that is way too long for me to talk without having a drink, so pardon me. Okay, so what do we taste on this wine? So I think with a extended lees contact wine, and this is a minimum of 3 years for their base level brut at Domaine Carneros, what I would be expecting to find in these wines is a combination of a sort of appley, like a golden apple, or something like, not like a super tart green apple. That's generally not what I'm looking for here. And I should mention this wine is a blend of about equal parts Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, kind of the two classic sparkling wine grapes, used not just in Champagne, but throughout the world. Although there are, of course, many other varieties that can be used for sparkling wine and are used for sparkling wine. But because they're the dominant grapes in Champagne, they have become the dominant grapes in sparkling wine making, kind of no matter where you find it, with some exceptions. So I was, like I said, I expect to find that kind of note of richer kind of golden apple. I expect to find a little hint of like a vanilla cream kind of thing, like creme brulee is sometimes how I think about it, or those kinds of flavors. And then the last thing that I often expect to find on these wines, and I do find it here, but it's not as in my face as I might expect, is actually there's a little bit of that, of a note of like a slight cherry quality. And that comes from the Pinot Noir. And the balance of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay is actually really fascinating to me, and something I kind of am always curious to know more about, is this idea of, you're not really getting you're not getting the pigment from Pinot Noir in this style of sparkling wine. You would potentially in a rosé, but not in a wine like this that is obviously not rosé. But you are getting flavors from the grape, and even though the skin contact in the winemaking is very minimal, I do think you pick up just a little bit of that kind of cherry red fruited note, which is I think kind of interesting. It's not always what I'm looking for in sparkling wine. I tend to find that if I'm really truly being put to it, the style I prefer best is a Blanc de Blanc, which is going to be made from exclusively Chardonnay or other white varieties in certain places. But there is something about that interplay of fruitiness that works, I think, in a lot of these wines and can be really delightful. And it's very classic for sparkling wine, kind of no matter where it's from. Okay, so let's talk about something, right? So I was talking at the very beginning of this about how we associate sparkling wine with needing a lot of acidity to kind of carry it through. And yet, this wine comes from Napa Valley. And I don't know how many of you have been to Napa. I know at least a few of you have, because I know most of you. Napa is not generally a place that we think of as being like the kind of cool, marginal growing place that Champagne is, where getting acidity in your grapes is frankly too easy for them most of the time. In Napa, you would have to imagine that generally speaking, this is not going to be the case. But Los Carneros is this really fascinating sort of sub AVA within the larger Napa Valley, and actually kind of connects to the Sonoma Valley AVA as well. And the reason for that is that you basically have this combination of really two sources of really cool wet air. So one is the San Pablo Bay, which Los Carneros basically sits directly north of. It's kind of an extension of the San Francisco Bay. And then the other is the Pacific Ocean coming through the Petaluma Gap. So if you look at a map, if you were curious and you look at where the Los Carneros AVA is, you can see that it's basically right at the end of the Petaluma Gap, which is a gap in the mountains that allows all this airflow, cold air and moist air to come in off the Pacific during the whole year, but it's especially pronounced in the warmer months during the growing season because you're really getting that temperature difference. So if you've ever, it makes sense, right? If you have this area that would normally be, this inland area that would normally be much hotter, and then you have all the cool, moist air that's sitting off the shore, that cool, moist air is going to be drawn in to this warm interior, and it will cool, it will create this layer of fog. And so Napa is famous for having this layer of fog that often rolls in, even during the height of the growing season, sometimes in the morning, and burns off generally, depending on where you are in the valley. Sometimes the fog doesn't even reach the northern end of the valley, which is why like the hottest parts of Napa are actually at the north end of the valley and the valley floor. As you move further south, there's more fog influence. It takes longer for it to burn off. And so even though we're in Napa, even though we think we're going to be somewhere warm, there's really it takes a long time in the morning, even into the early afternoon sometimes, for this fog to burn off, for the temperature to warm up. And so that's really the reason why you're able to make these wines here, because you are not getting the accelerated ripening that you might expect from fruit grown even just a short distance to the north. And that's why here they're growing Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. And if you were to, like I said, go 15, 20 miles north, all of a sudden you're in the middle of Cabernet Sauvignon country, which typically you would not see these three varieties. Well, Chardonnay you might see grown throughout the valley, but you wouldn't see Pinot Noir and Cabernet grown within 15 or 20 miles of one another in very many other parts of the world. But just because of this effect of these two bodies of cool water, they're able to do it in Los Carneros. So Domaine Carneros was founded by Claude Tattinger of the Champagne Tattinger, which is one of the more acclaimed and larger champagne producers in France. And they founded the winery in 1987. It's cool. The founding winemaker, Eileen Crane, is still one of the winemakers there, still heavily involved in the winemaking process. She's been there since day one. And it's really kind of a cool story because Domaine Carneros, along with Roeder Estate, which was founded earlier in the 80s and 82 by Louis Roeder, another big champagne house, really created this idea that you can make great sparkling wine in California. And because California is such the dominant player in American wine, it really put American sparkling wine on the map. This idea that, you could make that these big champagne houses who do not generally for one, you would think they know their business, they know sparkling wine, and they understand the kind of conditions you need, saw that there's a potential for great sparkling wine in California. And that idea has been sort of carried forward out of the state. And to be fair, there was some sparkling wine being made out of the state prior to this and in California without this influence, but it was definitely a validation for sparkling wine throughout the US. As I mentioned before, this vintage 2015 is 53% Chardonnay, 47% Pinot Noir. Spends a minimum of 3 years on the lees. I'm actually going to look because the thing that I didn't look at before this. No, it does not say on here when the bottle was disgorged, so I don't actually know exactly how long it's spent on the lees. So the disgorgement date, as I mentioned, is when it's the bottle, the sort of aging process ends, and then the bottle is sealed. So it could have been since 2015. It could have been in early 2019. It could have also been, 3 months ago. I don't know. Something to be aware of with sparkling wine. It's rare that you see a disgorgement date on most of these bottles. I would say that I would be a little leery of wines that were probably unless they're really, really high quality sparkling wine, I would be very leery of wines that were disgorged multiple, like say 2 or 3 years ago. So if this were a Domaine Carneros bottle from say 2011, and I didn't know that it had been a late disgorged, and actually Domaine Carneros actually releases a line if they're late disgorged brut. And I don't think they do that every vintage. They do it with the better vintages. And those spend more time than 3 years on the lees. But otherwise, I would be a little bit skeptical because sparkling wine, like everything, develops, matures, and fades over time. And with sparkling wine, that fading involves losing carbonation over time, and also just kind of a dulling of the flavors in general. And that can be kind of a bummer. I've had some older bottles of like good but not great sparkling wine and that are older, and you just kind of like, there's not much here. Sad. Interesting, maybe, but not that tasty. And speaking of quality, and I kind of wanted to finish up a part of this with talking about quality because it's such a it is such a what I say, it's such a subjective thing in a lot of ways. But when we're talking about quality in sparkling wine and what might say prompt someone to buy a bottle of this wine, which is $35 to $40 retail most places, versus say the Gruet that we started out with, which is $15 to $20 retail, or there's obviously much more expensive sparkling wine out there, not just champagne. So what is it that we're looking for in terms of quality? What would prompt us to think, okay, this wine is worth it? Well, there's a sort of ineffable, like, I like the way it tastes, right? Which is cool. But I think for me, the thing I'm looking for in these wines is, on the more expensive side, is a sort of complexity of flavor. So like I'm saying, there's this interplay here of the fruit notes, the notes from lees aging, and also this other kind of cherry and floral note that comes through from the Pinot Noir. The second is I'm really looking for elegance, and in particular the elegance of the bubbles themselves. And so I'm going to take another moment here to taste. And I think it's important when tasting sparkling wine to, one of your first tastes of it, if you're really trying to assess the wine's quality, is to really like feel what the texture and the, I don't know, for lack of a better word, the kind of like depth or amount of bubbles there are. And there are different ways to assess this, but I like to think about kind of like, just how fizzy is it, right? And not that I want the absolute most assertive effervescence in my wine, but I do want to feel like I'm getting a really sparkling wine here. And I certainly feel that way about this. But you'd be surprised. There's some sparkling wine out there that's actually, it's not cheap, and that's also kind of not good, unfortunately, like anything else, right? And then the last thing, and again, this is coming back to what I was saying before, and it a little bit goes with your own taste. I do look for with these wines, and certainly with wines that have more extended lees contact, I really want to smell and taste that, right? If we're paying for a wine that's, because part of what you're paying for in cost is just the amount of time it takes to make the wine. So if I'm paying for a wine that took 5, 6, 7 years to make, I want to taste that in the wine. I don't just want to be told that this wine was aged on its lees for 5 years and then feel like I can't even tell, because then what am I paying for? So that's an important thing to me. And again, that comes from those sort of cheese, Parmesan, brioche notes that I find really enjoyable, but are not for everyone. So I want to give you the opportunity here. I'm going to finish up with some pairings and a little bit of news about what I'm going to be doing going forward. But if you have any questions or any other thoughts, and Nicole, I'm going to express my sympathies to you. Napa I don't know when wineries will be opening up in Napa. Summer seems like maybe it won't happen, or at least in a very limited fashion. That's no inside information. That's just a guess. So, sparkling wine has this incredible versatility with food. There's, as I said, I think when we did the Gruet episode or class, there's not a lot that doesn't pair with this, with the exception of maybe like, I wouldn't necessarily have like a really, really rich steak with this or something along those lines, although it's a lovely day here in Seattle, so that's not really what I'm in the mood for anyhow. But outside of that, sparkling wine is super versatile. It can stand on its own. It's one you can just enjoy by itself, but you can also have it with, almost any kind of seafood. You can have it with white meat like chicken, turkey, pork even. You can have it with vegetables. It does really well with even sort of assertive vegetable flavors, things like, artichokes, asparagus, things in the spring that are otherwise hard to pair. And actually my other thing, and then of course you can do great with cheeses and things like that. But my other one that I love with this is I think this does really well with like weird kind of earthy things like lentils, right? Like we don't think, not that anyone, well, maybe someone out there is like, I fucking love lentils, but most of us are like, lentils are fine. But there's something about the earthiness of those that is like, the sparkling wine, a good sparkling wine kind of like lightens it and brings it up, and it kind of takes you out of the dirt, which is with things like lentils, I think a positive. So yeah, like I said, there's not very much that you can't pair this with, which is a reason why my wife and I have a lot of sparkling wine in the house at all times. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to wrap things up as far as talking about the Domaine Carnero. So of course, if you have questions, send them in. But I am going to spend just a minute or two talking about what I have planned going forward. So for the time being, this exact format of tasting is going to at least go on a little bit of a pause because I'm working to develop a number of different online classes that'll be a little more structured than what we're doing here. Right now, the two that I'm working on developing are a Red Wines of Italy class, and that'll be a 4-week class with sort of each class will have 3 different wines in it. And then the other is a class focusing on the wines of Washington. So I will have, and that'll be an exploration of some specific varieties here in Washington, some parts of the state, and other things that I think are really exciting. So I will have more information about the specifics, when those classes will be, what wines will be involved, all that coming up. And I'm hoping to have the details finalized by the end of the week, probably, but I'm not sure because, who knows what's going to come up. But certainly by early next week. So I'm hoping that that'll be something that some of you or all of you are interested in. There'll be a little more, the classes will be on Zoom, they won't be on YouTube, so they will be a little more opportunity to interact. That's going to be kind of the idea, to kind of give you a chance to taste and converse as opposed to just hearing me talk at you. Not that maybe you enjoy that, but I do think at some point then, shortly after I get those things kind of squared away, I will be trying to do some of these regular classes on YouTube and Instagram Live to just to reach out to everyone to have a chance to talk. But I will be, for the next week or so, be focusing on getting these other classes launched. So I don't have a date yet for the next one of these on YouTube and Instagram Live, but hopefully it will be happening soon. So yeah, I want to thank you all for joining. Those of you who were here for all 12, I wish I had a prize for you. But even for those of you who just joined in today, thanks again for joining me here on Disgorged Online. Like I said, I'll be back with some more information soon, so keep tuned to the YouTube channel, to Instagram Live, and to my various social media if you don't have it. And if you have questions or thoughts, catch me on these, Zach at disgorgedwine.com. And again, like I said, thank you so much. Really enjoyed it, and hopefully you have too.